This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We kick off this Friday's show with this week's grain market update from K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Dan shares that most futures markets experienced quite the drop this past week and follows up with the rest of the insight he gained from the USDA's recent 99th Annual Outlook Forum. Also ahead, as demand in the wheat industry continues to evolve over time, producers might begin to think about their production goals differently. K-State wheat specialist Romulo Lollato joins us to share insight on the demand for higher quality proteins in wheat as opposed to just yields. We round out today's show with this week's agricultural weather report from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip highlights the severe weather experienced by some parts of the state this past week, the anticipated cooler temperatures for March, and the potential for frost damage in areas where plants have already started to green up. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien for this week's grain market update. So before we get into things, Dan, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Samantha.
We've got a lot to catch up on in the past week, so let's go ahead and start with futures. What have those markets shown?
Well, it's been a week in which the futures markets took a move to the downside for the feed grains anyway, and also a little bit lower on the wheat. Closed on Thursday with the May contract at 633 3/4 and D's at 570. Perhaps now, by this time of year, there's still some grain being held over. We can have our attention on the new crop bids. 570 is down about 25 cents, 30 cents from where we had been for a good amount of time throughout the winter. So, that affects, of course, both new crop corn and grain sorghum bids. When you look at soybeans, closed at 1367 on Thursday, and that happened to be up from the previous day's close. May, the lead contract now 1509. So still, we have pretty strong support for what's happening in the soybean market. And on the wheat market, Kansas City hard red winter wheat, generally down lower. Some of the moisture that we've got in parts of the West has no doubt had some impact on what the prospects for the crop are and what how traders are bidding. I'm really curious to see what our climatologists and others say about what their take is on soil moisture, on weather prospects going forward. But as we're sitting right now, we have caught some moisture, at least in the northern part of western Kansas. I'm curious to see what's still out there in the southern parts and other areas around the state. But generally, we have had more moisture, and I would say in looking at some of the moisture maps over the last bit of time, although the drought monitor does show that we're still quite dry in a lot of the areas we had been dry in for a while. When you look at accumulated moisture over the last 30 days or last 90 days, it does show that the northern plains have caught quite a bit. Of course, a lot of that's snow, and they had to dig it out, but it's still there, and interesting to watch all of that. I think when you look at the last 90 days in terms of moisture, the percent of moisture relative to what we have had in the past, that the one place in the Corn Belt that still holds out on the worst side is actually kind of a streak from southwest Kansas up into the center part of the state. So our friends and neighbors in southwest part of the state are still suffering some of that. I would say that, again, coming out of that Ag Outlook conference a week prior, we did get some interesting news about how the transition from the La Nina weather pattern it had hung around for a bit, that's forecast now to occur moving forward to transition to a La Nina, would bring moisture to parts of the western Corn Belt. And we would probably in the areas that we were dry in, well, that'd bring moisture to those same areas and actually some dryness to some key parts of the eastern Corn Belt. But if anything, it's kind of up in the air. It's that it is how in a transition year, which is kind of what the climatologists sort of view this, at least the ones we heard at the USDA conference, how in a transition year, how quickly do we see that? Do we see this change from dry in the western Corn Belt to wet in parts of the western Corn Belt? I guess we'll be watching for that. I would say also, we talked about cash bids, and as the futures have gone lower, we've certainly seen basis weaken in most of the areas. Still strong, of course, surprisingly strong still in southwest Kansas for corn. Best new crop bid that I could see anyway in looking at elevator bids. And now there are ethanol plant bids and feedlot bids that may be more. But at least for elevator bids, about $1.21 over, and that's still heroically standing strong, I guess, across the state. The next closest bids Then part of that was in the Garden City area. Next closest bids would be actually Hutchinson, 74 over. Columbus area has one or two bids that are pretty strong at 61 over, followed by then Colby, 54 over, and Salina, Topeka, a little bit weaker. New crop bids still in Garden City, 55 over at 625 for the best bids, which compares to the next strongest bids of basically at even money at 570 in Salina. Getting to the place where if someone were really looking to lock in new crop bids, but these differences are almost what we call truckable. You could put grain from one area to the next and truck it to somewhere. Now, without anything planted yet, I don't know that people are really looking to do that, but pretty stark differences between Southwest Kansas and the rest of the state. I would also say we've been paying attention to grain sorghum quite a bit with some extension meetings we've had of late. One in Hoisington, out in the central part of the state, just a day or so ago. And grain sorghum bids really holding up pretty decently. If anything, a little bit more uniformity across the state with grain sorghum bids than with corn. New crop bids, not too bad. Again, the best one, again, is Southwest Kansas at 561. And that's generally comfortably, if we get decent yields, that's covering cost of production. So soybean bids still holding up amazingly strong. Topeka has a bid of 4 cents over. So you wonder, are they filling trains or what are they doing over there at 15.24? That'd be on Thursday. And new crop bids, the strongest ones against Salina, Topeka, and also Hutchinson. So kind of a triumvirate there of strong new crop bids. Wheat bids have suffered in the last week. We've seen a fair drop-off in futures, and basis hasn't changed that much that I could see anyway as we try to monitor these locations. So new crop bids now for wheat, more along the lines of 771, 782, 759 at the lowest. So we're at a place where we're still making money, but yeah, we're in February. And the seasonal price trends from February on now into March, April, and May are generally been stronger and higher. So I should say something else. It's sure a question as to what caused the drop-off that we'd seen in last week. Now, some of it may have to do with the beginning of the delivery period for that March contract relative to these other contracts. So you didn't see a lot of whipsawing between the March and May, but we have seen some forced movement out of the March contract as people liquidated their positions there. If they were forced to sell, that would had been long positions, well, they'd sell March, they'd buy other contracts. So we've seen some movement apparently out of that March contract, and I guess I'll trust the market situation better once we get beyond this delivery period to see where we stand. The other factor, Samantha, that I'd bring up is that, we have ongoing issues out in Argentina and Brazil. Now in Brazil, we have increased concerns that the moisture they've had down there, which was basically viewed as, well, rain makes grain. Well, it sort of did for soybeans, I guess, but has delayed their harvest some and has also delayed their planting of their second crop, or I think they call it the safrinha corn crop. And that then pushes that development of that crop in parts of that country out the back end of their optimal growing season, out into a drier time. So that could affect us in terms of corn demand down the road, just about the time when we're planting corn. And the situation in Argentina hasn't changed any. In fact, we have reports coming out in the last 1 or 2 days that it's very likely that the numbers the USDA had will continue to be ratcheted lower. So I stand back and look at all that, and an eventful week. New information, of course, out of the USDA. I look at those USDA figures now with a week of perspective, and generally, I don't doubt the acreage numbers at all that the USDA is putting out. They all seem to be pretty relevant. A negative hit on cotton for sure, but everything else even to a little bit higher. So yeah, that makes sense. The USDA's trendline yields for corn seem to be on the high side and end up presenting a lot more negative picture than I think we'll end up with in the bigger scheme of things. And what it comes down to is they predicted a trendline yield of 181.5 bushels per acre for this growing season. That is fully about 4.5 bushels higher than anything we've ever attained. So that makes you wonder about whether we'll be able to actually attain that. And if so, then their projection on prices at 560. And really, if we actually got what they're talking about, we'd probably be less than 560. So I'm not saying there's any politics involved, but really it's more of a moderate price relative to where it could go. Is more like, am I thinking 525 to 540 or something? So be that as it may. But the sorghum number for prices is exactly the same as corn, and that would be a setback from where sorghum has been. We have been bidding a little bit higher than corn. For wheat, not a lot of changes there in wheat, but in that balance sheet that they project in the coming year, they're anticipating a pretty strong exports. They're anticipating large export rebound in grain sorghum also, so I hope we get that. But for exports, increase of 50 million bushels, and one thing that's happened quickly this last week, we got news of the strong buying move in wheat, surprisingly positive in terms of the wheat purchases for the week ending on, I think it was February the 23rd, and numbers that are actually downright bullish. So we got bullish export numbers at a time when the price has fallen off. Well, I guess I just attribute that to shrewd international buyers. When they see prices falling off, well, this is the time to go. So apparently they did. So I guess I've sort of monologued my way through that, Samantha, in terms of the overall picture. So if you ask me what my thoughts are on where the markets are going, I think generally we've taken information in. Maybe the biggest factor of all is we're in February. We don't have any field work yet. And we've caught a little bit of rain, and we're not paying a lot of attention to South America, some of the problems they have down there. But again, we were in February, we're now into March. And once we start getting into the field and having some actual production risks from the U.S. come into play, I don't know that we'll see any fast recoveries in the U.S. side unless the Brazilian numbers prove to be just that much lower than we thought. And we'll have to wait till the next March WASDE report, which is just around the corner.
Sure, yeah, that growing season starting way earlier than it seemed like it was supposed to. It seems like it's just around the corner now. I feel like I've blinked and now it's March. So thank you so much for recounting everything from the USDA outlook. I know that was a huge meeting and a lot of information that was valuable to be shared. So thank you so much for joining us and sharing all of that with us today.
Thank you, Samantha. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien joining us for this week's Grain Market Update. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by K-State wheat specialist Romulo Lollato for a conversation on wheat industry changes and some upcoming events, our Wheat RX programs here at K-State. So before we get into things, Romulo, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Samantha. Thank you for having me on the program today.
Absolutely. We're happy to have you as always. And we've seen a lot of changes recently in what is being asked of Kansas producers. So when we think historically of what we're used to seeing of producers, what were the expectations before?
That's a good question. And historically in Kansas, the Kansas wheat grower has not been paid based on protein. Usually it has been bushels. How much production is out there, that's usually how much they are going to get paid for. It's based on production. Now, it's not to say that there hasn't been here and there some specific protein markets in high-yielding years, right? But historically it has been bushels. Part of that is because Kansas has a lot of heat stress later down the season. So some years there is a large offer of protein in the market just because of heat stress later in the season. But again, historically, bushels have been the main driver of how producers get paid when they grow wheat in Kansas.
The shift that we're going to be talking about, kind of the demand for different quality, higher protein aspects when it comes to the wheat produced. When did that sort of happen, and how has that evolved over time to now?
Thinking back on the time that I have been in Kansas here, I remember that there was a lot of talk about protein premiums in 2016 and 2017 as well. Now, thinking back, those were two very high-yielding years. What that tells me is that whenever there is yield potential based on weather, we don't have the fertility to keep up. And so most of the state ends up producing low-protein wheat, which is also an indication that we're leaving yield on the table. If we're producing less than 11.5% or 12% protein, very likely we didn't have enough nitrogen to max out yields. So protein can be an indicator of whether we were near the maximum yield of that crop for those yielding conditions or not. Then 2018 was so hot and dry that we didn't see any protein premiums. Now 2019 and 2020 and even 2021, we had some protein premiums show up here and there. So I think it has been recent, right? Something in the last 7 years or so that we started seeing scattered markets for protein showing up. And more recently here, I think we have more organized efforts to source for high-protein wheat, whether it is based on millers and bakers' wants and what they need, or even the new protein plants that are being developed in Kansas.
Those new protein plants, it's going to be a significant demand from those plants for Kansas wheat specifically. So where are those plants going to be located, and what does that mean for local markets?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good local market for Kansas wheat growers, especially in the areas of Russell with pure field ingredients and Phillipsburg with Amber Wave. So those two protein plants, I don't have the exact numbers with me, but I heard something around 10% of the total wheat production in Kansas can be consumed by those two together, or even more than that. So, if we think of internationally, that's probably not a huge deal, but for the Kansas wheat grower that usually half of the wheat is exported from Kansas, to have two plants that can actually use 10% or more of the wheat crop, that's huge. Now, they will have some specific conditions, like, for example, the wheat needing to be more than 12% protein, but the market will be there, and very likely there will be a premium for growers who are able to deliver that protein for those companies. So that's a big thing going on in Kansas now, that we will actually use a lot of the Kansas wheat being produced. A different initiative that has been going on for perhaps a little bit longer is actually some programs by wheat mills or even bakers who are actually able to pay growers not only for yields but for quality as well. Sometimes those programs, they have a traceability aspect to them, and so growers, they will need to report, for example, which varieties were planted in that given field that is being harvested and other management practices as well. But that is another opportunity that is maybe more of a niche opportunity, but that some growers are able to capitalize on it as well.
Some great markets there, especially for our Kansas producers. You mentioned, 10 to 12% potentially just going to those two protein plants. That's a significant amount of wheat going there when you think about, the percentage of our nation's wheat that is produced just here in our home state. Yeah,
absolutely. And that will benefit producers in north central, northwest Kansas who can just deliver directly there and get that premium for that protein. So again, a huge demand for that high protein wheat, which some years we have no problem finding it if the weather is not very favorable for the crop. But in some years, it can be rare to find. Whenever we have good yielding conditions, cooler temperatures during the grain filling period, more rainfall during the grain filling period as well, which combined make the plant put more starch in the grain, and so it dilutes whatever protein amount we have out there.
How does this demand for protein kind of influence our Kansas producers' decision-making? Is it through management or maybe even variety selection?
I think that it will influence Kansas wheat growers from the very beginning, which is variety selection. Whenever we talk about wheat quality and wheat protein, 50 to 70% of that protein is determined by environment. But another 30 to 50% of it is what we do, right? It is under our control. And so what variety we're putting out there is extremely important, especially when we're thinking about the quality of that protein, meaning can that wheat make a loaf of bread? Because some varieties, they may produce 12, 13% protein, but low quality protein, while other varieties may have even lower protein but make a better loaf of bread. So when we talk about protein quality, variety is a main determinant. So much so that some of these companies that are looking to make a loaf of bread, they have developed preferred variety lists. Growers need to start with one of those varieties from their lists, and then they go on from there to the other management practice. So there's a prerequisite of some of these niche programs that growers start with a given variety because of their quality profile. But management as well, especially fertility management, it's really associated with protein itself. If we're limited on nitrogen amount, that's going to limit our protein as well, and so lower quality grain out there. So usually fertility type of limitations, they will limit our bread making ability. But fungicides are also important. Fungicides that will be more related to milling ability of that grain. So what does a miller want? He wants a nice plump kernel, high test weight, high 1,000 kernel weight, and that comes with our foliar fungicides, right? When we put our foliar fungicide, we tend to increase that kernel weight and the test weight of that kernel. On the other hand, bakers, they want a high protein wheat because they get the flour already. So they don't necessarily care about the 1,000 kernel weight or test weight. They want a high protein wheat. And that's through fertility. So there are many things that we do on the farm that will actually be part of that 50% that we can take care of. And a lot of that comes down to fertility management, fungicide management, and variety selection.
Wow. I learned something new every day through this show. And that's something that I just learned is management. Who knew that there was such demand for different aspects from our producers? So that influences highly their decisions, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Now, historically, this management piece with fertility and fungicides and things like this, it has lumped into the environment. So if you listen to some older folks, they're going to say, well, yeah, environment is 70 or 80%, and then 20 is genetics. That's not wrong. But out of those 70 or 80%, 30 of it is management. So it is in our hands. So we need to change that mentality of lumping management within environment, because we can take care of management, whereas most of the time we cannot take care of environment.
Romulo, I know that a lot of this is sort of the topics that you'll be discussing in upcoming WheatRx programs. And these are such great opportunities for producers to learn directly from specialists like yourself in the wheat industry.
Yeah, so WheatRx is a collaborative initiative between Kansas State University Research and Extension with the Kansas Wheat Commission, which represents the Kansas wheat grower, right? So they have their interests in hand there. So together we came down and we noticed, well, there is this change in the industry, so we need to change how we're doing things in terms of extension as well, so we can bring this knowledge to the growers so he or she can know what to do in their own farms. Together with the Kansas Wheat Commission, starting in 2022, last year, we had a few educational programs. We actually had 2 winter schools and then 2 pre-plant meetings. And then this year, again, we're having 2 winter schools. We're having 1 field day in May and then pre-plant meetings again. And it's not only an educational component, but we also have a strong research component. So it's good to remind growers that everything that we're presenting in these meetings, it has been researched at K-State. But the idea of the WheatRx programs is to answer how can we grow high yield, high quality wheat in a way that is still environmentally responsible and makes economic sense for the grower.
Absolutely. Yeah, some real applicable information for producers out there. And I know there are some costs associated with these programs, but these costs don't just pay for the opportunity to learn that day, but they pay for a membership as well, correct?
Yes. So for growers who are members of Kansas Association of Wheat Growers, COG, or the National Association of Wheat Growers, NOG, the cost is waived. We ask that they register, so we have a head count beforehand, but it is free to attend the program. For growers who are not members of COG or NOG, the cost is $110. Now, this is the very same cost of getting the membership, right? So we don't really want growers paying to attend the program. We want growers to become members of COG or NOG. That will have a number of other benefits throughout the year. And one of those benefits is getting to attend these meetings for free.
If listeners are tuning in and they're wanting to take advantage of this opportunity and register, how can they do that?
They can go to the Kansas Wheat website, which is kswheat.com, and there will be a WheatRx link out there. The 2 upcoming seminars that we have, they're actually next week. They're March 7th, which is Tuesday in McPherson, and then March 8th, which is Wednesday on Russell. So very excited about this program. Hopefully growers can join us March 7th on McPherson, March 8th in Russell. Just go to the Kansas Wheat website, click on the WheatRx link there, and register for it. If you're not a COG or NOG member, just become a member and your registration is waived.
Wonderful. Romulo, thanks so much for joining us today for this conversation and talking about these programs that are going to be so impactful for producers.
Thank you, Samantha. I appreciate the opportunity of being here today.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State wheat specialist Romulo Lollato joining us for a conversation on wheat industry changes as well as upcoming WheatRx programs. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond for this week's agricultural weather report. So, Chip, thanks for joining us.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So this past week was not really eventful for our neck of the woods, but eventful for other areas in terms of severe weather, right?
Yeah, we had widespread rainfall across about 95% of the state, except for along the Colorado border, and that came in the form of severe weather, especially for folks down in southwest Kansas. We had some severe reports extending to southeast, but not nearly as widespread. We measured as much as 97-mile-an-hour winds on the Mesonet, and that's pretty windy.
Yeah.
Thankfully, the tower's still there, and everything's reporting. But unfortunately, there was also damage that went along with that in areas like Sublette and Liberal, where they did confirm a tornado on the east side. So, great reminder, severe weather season's here. We're seeing the contrasting air masses and dynamic weather patterns that are expected with spring, and it's going to continue for the next few months. And look to our south, where Oklahoma had up to 20 potential tornadoes in this event. That was their busiest February day on record. And unfortunately, that could be a taste of things to come as that jet stream starts to migrate further northward as you get later into spring.
Conflicting weather patterns, of course, what we expect this time of year. But this event was also kind of interesting in terms of the dust that carried through in some of this rain, right?
Yeah, a lot of people in eastern Kansas and even further east than that into Missouri all have very, very dirty cars that they parked outside. Usually rain is great to wash off the salt and wash off the grime for the last few months. That didn't happen because we had a significant dust storm associated with this storm system in eastern New Mexico and western Texas, and that lofted a lot of dust. And once we got that rainfall, the particulate was in the cloud, and when the rain fell, it dragged it down with it and covered everything with a little piece of New Mexico and Texas.
Yeah, I know my car currently is still covered, so hopefully I'm not the only one in that.
Well, hopefully you can see out your windows. Please be safe and clean your car.
Yes, the windows are clean, Chip. Appreciate that tidbit. But now when we expect kind of the week ahead, I know we're warming up a bit more than we maybe anticipated, and we're going to see that through the weekend.
Yeah, so as you record this, we've had a couple of days of cooler weather. We're going to surge back warm again this weekend. We could touch 70 and probably will for most of the state on Sunday. And then we'll cool down a little bit Monday, and then a significant cold front comes through as a big push of cold air comes south and eastward. It's been building out west for a while, and that's going to drop temperatures 20 to 30 degrees below normal for the next 2 to potentially 3 weeks. So really a lot of March is going to be colder than normal. We'll still keep that active weather pattern, though, which is really interesting because usually when we get really cold, we have northwest wind and not much moisture. But we'll still have some chances of precipitation with that. And so when we get cold, maybe we'll start to talk the snow word a little bit more as we go into the future, potentially as early as next week.
Wow. So good to know on that front. And this is probably bad news for those of our friends that are maybe, looking forward to gardening or planting. Soil temperatures aren't really aiding in that.
Yeah, soil temperatures have definitely come up over the last week or so. We're 40 degrees plus for most of the state, except for the 4 northwest where they're cooler. It was kind of like a false spring, false hope. Don't get excited and start working in the garden because cold weather is coming, and we'll see the soil temperatures as a result fall. And that'll have an impact on maybe some more sensitive crops or produce and that sort of thing. In far southeast Kansas, where green-up's progressed enough that we're starting to see a lot of green grass and trees are budding out. So definitely some concern for frost and freeze damage in those areas.
And for wheat, potentially, some of those wheat crops kind of starting to perk up a bit, too? Yeah,
wheat. I went down to Garnett this week, and you could tell the wheat was way different than it is in this neck of the woods. And it just had moisture and more heat. And as you get further down in Cherokee County, it's progressing even further. And so we're still not into that next stage of tillering yet. You can see the growing degree units on the Kansas Mesonet wheat GDD page. So it's progressing, and as we move ahead, we get more warmth. It's going to continue, but this cold is definitely going to set things back.
Absolutely. A great reminder of the tools on the Mesonet as well for our producers out there that are interested in kind of following that timeline. So a great resource to check out. And as always, Chip, can't thank you enough for visiting with us today.
Thanks again.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond joining us for this week's Agricultural Weather Report. That concludes this week's programming. We'll be back with more on Monday on Agriculture Today.